All right, welcome. Just to introduce us a little bit, we are here having a quick chat just to talk about the difference between my intuitive healing work, my readings, my spiritual meditation classes I teach versus my 3 and 6 month coaching packages, where it oftentimes will start with a reading to kind of give the overview and snapshot of where someone's at, to kind of look at some of the patterning and energies around them. But then we pretty quickly start to use this German New Medicine map to look at symptoms and see what message the symptom has for us, to see what the higher purpose of that symptom is, whether that's physical or mental or even just an expression in life, like a life pattern that you keep bumping into. It all tracks together, it all maps together. And so we go into this most gross, dense form of the body and the symptoms. And as we heal it, we go into it, it brings it into this most subtle, highest form of spirit. It brings you back to more wholeness. Because if you're living totally peaceful, happy, enlightened, you're probably not going to have a lot of symptoms, right? It's when we start to get conflicted and we're living out of harmony with that wholeness of self that the symptoms tend to arise. So, anyway, this video is just to kind of answer some questions around what's the difference between that intuitive work and this somatic inquiry practice and coaching style that I use in par with the German New Medicine lens to help people break through patterns, heal symptoms, get really great results. So I'll pass it to you, Irvi. What questions do you have?
I guess just a deeper explanation of GNM and the differences between that versus intuitive training and how you can use both in parallel when you're trying to look at the energy, but also the physical body.
Mm, yeah, great question. So, with intuitive training, you learn how to be aware of energy and aware of patterns. And there's actually been a lot of intuitives that have written their own books that would track certain symptoms or uh, things that have manifested in people's bodies with an emotional root cause. Like the Lewis Hayes books and several others that have done something similar. And so German New Medicine, it's just a little bit of scientific backing to that, basically, because I won't get into the whole depth of German New Medicine because I made a separate video for that I'll share with you and anyone who wants it. But essentially, there was a doctor who started to realize like, oh yeah, I think there is this correlation between cancer specifically is where he started and shocking, conflicting events that happened before somebody got the cancer. And so he did a bunch of brain scans that could correlate what conflict they went through. So the psychological wound or spiritual wound, where it showed up in the brain, and then what organ it showed up in, and what disease, illness it would cause. And so GNM, it works in par with intuitive work. In fact, that's actually how I got into it, is I was doing consistent healings for somebody, and they were like, huh, you keep reading stuff and it lines up with German New Medicine. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but that sounds cool. And I looked it up and I was like, oh, yeah, interesting. The energy that I'm reading here and the conflicts that have been mapped and proven do really line up. But the thing that I sometimes see with energy work is you'll get an understanding of the pattern, the energy that's causing a symptom, and you'll possibly even clear that energy out in a session and feel temporarily better. But sometimes even intuitives have been conditioned by the medical world in society. And so they're reading through the lens of their own mind. And so if they've been really conditioned that a certain thing means a certain thing, or even if they're really good medical intuitive, because I've gone to all of them, right? I've had some of the most renowned medical intuitives read me, and they were fairly accurate, but then they were conditioned by the holistic paradigm and they would go, oh, okay, so take these supplements, take this or that to try to heal it. And so it's oftentimes missing the basic understanding of the fact that your body's not making a mistake. It's not fighting against itself. Symptoms aren't random, but they have a very specific pattern that they're linked to. And you can use supplements and nutrition and exercise and stuff to aid in the healing. You can use energy work to aid in the healing to make it easier, but it isn't necessarily going to address the root cause. If you don't know what actually is causing your body to activate a defense system to protect you, and that defense system is still activated even years later, causing this chronic illness or symptom, if you don't know the actual root cause, then any attempt at trying to heal it, it's kind of missing the point. It's just like, medications. It's trying to curb symptoms so you can live with it rather than the deeper spiritual healing of getting to the root cause of it and turning that around. So I think they pair really well together. German New Medicine and Somatic Inquiry, it just gives someone access to the knowledge so they can link it up. So when they're experiencing something, whether it's like diarrhea or whether it's anxiety, even stuff like that, you can go, oh, here's exactly why it's happening. Here's exactly what my body's trying to defend me from or what it's afraid of. And you start to be able to track it back to, oh, here's why I'm operating off of that information. That's why my body and brain is still in this defense pattern. And so the knowledge itself is part of the healing because we're very intellectual beings. And so if we have some sort of proof or we can intellectually understand it, it allows us to not resist the healing that's happening. Because some people, well, everyone, when they get symptoms, it's part of a healing phase. Your body's trying to complete a process and heal. But that's when people get on medication or where they do something drastic to try to change that. And sometimes that literally stops the healing process in its track. So just the knowledge of like, oh, this is what I'm feeling and this is where I'm at in that cycle. So I can just let it play out or help myself in a way that's actually aiding it and not stopping the healing process. Okay, great. Right. It's kind of like even when people are doing mental work and they're trying to undo a pattern, and then they see some of that pattern come up in their life and they think, oh, it must not have worked. I must not have got to it. But it's actually just in the healing process where they're now very aware of it. And now they get to go, oh, look at this pattern. Here's why I believed that pattern. Here's why I held on to it in the first place. I'm going to allow myself to let go of it now in this moment, in this active choice. And then it gets to complete. They don't backtrack on their healing through this self doubt or not understanding where they are in that process. So it acts just as a good guide, really.
I think something you said kind of answers my next question, which is like that knowledge you gather, getting to the root causes, the healing can be the healing itself. So I guess my question was, once you get to the root cause, does that mean the healing happens? How do you know that it works and can it come
Mm.
back? Can there be like another trigger that can cause
Uh-huh.
something similar to happen again?
Okay, that's kind of three questions in one, but I'll try to remember them and break them down. So first of all, before your question even, the knowledge itself is sometimes enough for somebody to have what we call a resolution and to heal, but more often than not, it's what sort of identity did you form that allowed you to have this belief or pattern, right? Because people try to change their thoughts to change their life, and that's true. That is how it works, but you can change your thoughts all day long, but if there's an underlying energy pattern that's stimulating those thoughts, they're going to come back. And so we use GNM as the map to find, okay, what exactly in my psyche is causing this particular pattern. But then underneath that is, oh, what kind of person would I have to believe myself to be, or what would I have to believe is true about the world in order for this memory, this event in the past to have been a conflict for me, for it to have been something that was really disturbing, painful, that puts you into this pattern in the first place. And so there's the knowledge, and then there's the shift in identity that happens, right? Which is also a shift in your beliefs, but it's one step back behind the belief. It's what creates the belief.
Quick sidebar question, is it something that happens in this lifetime or can there be past lifetime stuff that carries into this lifetime?
Hmm, that's a good sidebar question. Yes, it can be past life stuff that's carried in, or it could be passed down through an ancestor line. But it would have to hold relevancy in this lifetime for it to affect you. So there would be something that's going on in this lifetime that sort of activates that. You know, you're pulling from that information. And so I don't really believe in the whole idea of genetics and things being passed down purely in a biological way, where if you have different relatives that have a certain type of cancer or whatever, that you're prone to it. I believe that they actually pass down perspectives. And so that perspective that they've been living off of that would cause them to have a conflict, that would then cause them to have that cancer, that's which acts that's what's actually passed down, right? And so in the way that you were raised, you know, your parents are feeding you their context of who they are and what the world is. And when you're really young, you're still forming that identity. And so you're forming that off of their information to a certain extent. And so yes, it could have those sort of ties into it. And you know, intuitive work, you would read that directly and go into like, oh, here's the past life, here's the relative it's coming from. With the somatic inquiry, you just go into the frame of what's coming up within you in the present moment. It's like that saying of the answer is always within you. So you go into that symptom, that experience that's right here. It's a clear message. And then it carries you into, you know, you might not necessarily have some profound vision of a past life, but you'll be carried into where in your life are you playing out a similar theme? Were you living with that identity or that mental context, and you'll question it so that you can turn it around. That's what the inquiry process is. And so I think the next part of your question was, how do you know when it's healed and can it come back? There's a couple ways. One, you could do it very scientifically. Like I got a non-contrast CT scan of my brain and I sent it to somebody who worked one-on-one very closely with Dr. Hammer, the guy who started GNM, and he read my brain scan and said, well, based off of these rings in your brain, you had these conflicts at this age. Here's where you had symptoms, and here's the symptoms you probably still have. Here's the things you're probably in based off of this, because it also goes into your psychological makeup, these conflicts that we have, your personality in a way. And so I have that. I have that snapshot. And so after I go through this process of resolving them, I could do another brain scan and show him and provably show that it's resolved. It's not necessary to do all of that. I just did it because it's fun. Yeah, it'll make good content someday. So the other way you know is the symptoms are gone, right? Whatever symptom you're working on or whatever pattern you're working on is gone. Or if it's even through the lens of like, I want to have healthy relationships or I want to be able to make more money, you know, it can be in those sort of things too. You'll know that it's happened because you're living in a new way where those sort of things are not a problem. Either they're resolved and you're living with the good relationship, you're living with the good money, or they just aren't a problem anymore, right? Um, so it's usually pretty clear when it's resolved. Can it come back? There's two answers to that. One, sometimes you resolve something. I've had this happen where I went into inquiry, I resolved something, but I was still experiencing symptoms periodically. And that's because I still had subconscious triggers in my life that reminded me of the original conflict and the person that I was, the lens that I was viewing the world from during that conflict. And so it would reactivate my symptoms as if I was back there in them. And so I had to take note of those subconscious triggers, which means you know what symptoms mean you're in healing phase versus conflict active. And so you go, oh, yeah, I just ate a banana and had this symptom, or oh, I was just thinking about this relationship problem and then had this symptom. You know, when you touch into that subtlety, you start to clear those subconscious tracks, and then it's put to bed, so to speak. It's gone. The second answer to that, though, is we live in a world that's constantly conditioning us, it's constantly programming us, and you might not have an entirely perfect life that never has any conflict. So you could resolve something, but then you could fall back into that way of thinking, or you could have something happen in your life that reinforces that old way of being. And so you start living from that again, and you have a version of it that comes back. If you go through the whole healing phase, your body's literally replenishing itself. There's cell proliferation, cell loss, there's this whole process that's happening. So if it came back again, it would likely be far less severe, especially if you had a conflict that was lasting for weeks or years and you resolved that. And then say 2 years later, you have another big life event. It might come back, but not to the same proportion that it ever was before. Right. And so it's kind of like an intuitive work where you're trying to clear the mental images in your mind so that you can see clearly. You're clearing through these mental patterns. You can clear them, but there's always the choice to go back, right? But if you've really done the work to kind of uproot it where it came from, you really convincingly see how what you believe to be true about yourself, the world, the memory isn't true, you're far less likely to have it happen again. Because even if it happened again, you wouldn't view it in the same way. You would go, oh, okay, that doesn't mean I'm bad, or that doesn't mean that I'm going to be abandoned. That's just an event that's happening, right? So some people, they could have one session and resolve a lifelong chronic condition and it never comes back. And somebody else, it could be a little bit of bouncing back and forth between before they're truly done with that way of thinking, of being, of seeing the world. It might take a little bit more investigation for them. And one of the most powerful ways to sort of solidify that healing and ensure it doesn't happen again is by living the turnaround, living the new truth that you find through that inquiry, through that shift. And in a way, you're kind of upgrading your life in every way as you do this. And so your life will be more stabilized. It's kind of like a funny thing my uncle once said. He was like, let me see if I can say it, how he said it. He's like, if you have the money to pay for a problem, it isn't really a problem because their dishwasher had like leaked all over the floor. And it was like, it's basically saying, like, why stress out over this when I can, just take care of it. It's not the end of the world. And that's kind of what happens is you resolve these deeply held beliefs, these inner conflicts, your life starts to improve. And so you have a better and better base. And so then things that would be conflicting in the past aren't so conflicting now because now you have that relationship, now you have that health, now you have that wealth, whatever it is. Um, so it's less likely to come back. Yeah.
It's awesome. I think you answered all my questions.
Woohoo! That was easy.
Yeah, makes a lot
Well,
more sense.
one other thing that I'll say too, to the point of me saying, you can make this kind of shift in healing through the spiritual lens, through the intuitive lens, or through the somatic lens. The only qualification that I see is that you have to see the truth so convincingly that you no longer believe the lie or live from it in any way. And in the intuitive work, people do that through reading, particularly through reading other people and seeing it over and over and over again. And it's kind of a big ask to ask somebody to show up week after week and continue doing readings, continue seeing the pattern. So the somatic side, it kind of helps with that element of it. But more so, the thing that I found that's interesting and why I've added this to my work is you have to see it convincingly enough to shift the pattern, but you're not just a mental being, right? Psychic work is of the psyche, of the mind, but you also have this physical body. You have this brain with different embryonic layers that have evolved through human evolution, through the body's evolution. And the brain doesn't see through your eyes, it receives the images that you're seeing. So if you're hallucinating something, you're fearing about something, it registers in the brain the same way as if you were physically looking at it. Um, And so part of the formula is the images that you see. You know, there's kind of a visual component, both of intuitive work and of somatic work, but then there's also registering it in the brain, in the subconscious specifically. That's what is tied into the brain relays that govern the body. And so if you can have not only your mind convincingly see that the thing that you believed is a lie and that there's a different truth, but also your body to receive that message. Well, the body's language is sensations, emotions. And so for some people, the intuitive stuff is enough that they can capture that new truth and integrate it. That's why there's energy tools to ground and be in the body and all of that stuff. But for a lot of people, the body hasn't received the message. There's a disconnect between the brain and body that's happening. And so the somatic piece, it adds the communication and connection to the body. And that's why it's particularly helpful for breaking patterns and physical symptoms and shutting off those brain relays. It communicates that all the way through.
It's really interesting. Yeah, I like the different layers of it.
Yeah, quite literally. Yeah.
Mhm. I could see how you could get into a rabbit hole about this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, endlessly. Yeah. And it's you know, even in the process of somatic inquiry, using one's intuition is really helpful. It helps you to find the meaning, the connections going into the memories. It makes all of that easier as long as you're able to not do it from a mental place. You know, if it's just the mental connection, that's where it sometimes doesn't work. So it's got to be the visual language of the spirit and the body connection. And that's where sometimes intuitives have a hard time because they're not used to going into the sensations, the feelings, and if you're not willing to meet these parts of yourself and feel it, communicate with it, then it's hard to heal it, right? Like one quick example, I had what they call a self-devaluation conflict, which creates essentially body pain. And so I've had chronic body pain for as long as I can remember, basically since I was a teenager. And when I was doing somatic inquiry into it, you know, I had read this many, many times, and I could see like, oh yeah, you're constantly beating yourself up, you're constantly telling yourself all you're bad, but it didn't really shift. And I went into somatic inquiry for that. And when I first got there to my high school self, that was really beating himself up, thinking he had to be negative to try to motivate him to succeed and do better. I could not say one nice thing for the first 3 times I tried that. It was like physically painful, right? If I was just in my mental space, absolutely. I'd be like, of course, little high school Brandon's deserving of love. Of course, he doesn't need to beat himself up. But when I was actually in the feeling of it, when I was getting the most somatic response possible, you're almost in the hypnotic state of the moment the conflict happened. And I literally could not say one nice thing for 3 tries. It wasn't until the fourth try that I was able to shift that and say a nice thing, right? And so I had to be able to really face the feelings, the energy, the psyche state that was there in that moment in order to switch that around and let it resolve. So it's a cool added component.
Definitely. Wow. I could see how it could be really helpful. Like once you get into once you're able to actually sink into that, right? And get into the feeling aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Psychics aren't always good feelers, you know. I thought that I couldn't cry. Like even one of my brothers, he's like, I've spent every day with you and I've never seen you cry. Uh and then like started doing somatic inquiry and I felt like I was being brought to tears almost every time. I was like, "Oh boy. There's some
Oh,
stuff in here that hasn't been felt." I had a really amazing cathartic healing the other day where I just cried in my car for like 2 hours straight, and went through this process where it felt like I was losing my mind. And if I didn't know GNM, I would have thought that I was losing my mind and like, you know, got on psych meds or something. But I was like, okay, this is a pretty intense healing phase. And then it cleared up afterwards, and I felt so differently about the world ever since. You know, I've viewed it in such a
oh,
different way. Um, yeah, it's been really cool. So sometimes that's how it happens. Get into those feelings.
Nothing like a good cry. Also, I like that you call it the healing phase. I think it's such a compassionate approach to it.
Yeah, yeah. Which sometimes intuitives call the growth period, but
Yeah, this is, yeah, it's nice. It's nicer.
yeah, yeah. And at the peak of a healing phase, you sometimes have the epileptoid crisis, which is where you might feel the peak of whatever you were feeling during the original conflict. So the one that I was healing was a overwhelm and hearing conflict that I had as a high schooler that gave me some symptoms of like schizophrenia, essentially. And so at the peak of my healing phase, I hit that epileptoid crisis and I was on the treadmill and I was hearing auditory hallucinations. And I was like, at first I was like, am I going crazy? And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. This is the healing phase. This is exactly the brain state that I was in freshman year of high school or sophomore year. I'm like, I totally remember this. And I just kept walking on the treadmill because one of the conflicts that I also had active affects your blood pressure. So my blood pressure was so high that my heart was at 130 when I got out of bed. That was my resting heart rate, which when your blood pressure's that high, you can't really think anymore. And so since I have this map, this information, I was like, okay, if I actually do some cardio, I walk on the treadmill, my heart rate would go down. That blood pressure would sort of level out. So anyway, I'm just happily walking on this treadmill having a schizophrenic episode, knowing it's the epileptoid crisis. And then afterwards, I basically sleep for 2 days and then I pop out of it and my brain is totally different. I'm like, woo, all right. There we go. But if you didn't know the map and what was going to happen to you, you'd just be in a psych ward.
Yeah, fair enough. That's so funny.
Yeah. Or you'd be in a lot of judgment, right? Like past me would be like, "Oh gosh, I'm such a POS. I'm supposed to be this great spiritual being and here I am having total psychosis." I would
Mhm.
confuse it as a failure and possibly even undo it. Whereas now I get to celebrate it and I can tell you about it and be like, "Yeah, look at how good of a healer I am. Look at that one." It's no longer a shameful thing because you know that your body's never doing anything wrong. It's just been trying to protect you. It has so many functions that are happening to protect us and keep us alive in any given moment. It's really truly amazing. And when you understand that that's all it's doing and can see that, there's so much more compassion for the experiences. It's just like, oh, okay. Good job, body. Do
Yeah,
your thing.
so nice.
Yeah, you're not identified with it, right? Like most people
Mhm.
they are their symptoms or they are their chronic illness or they are that intense experience. Even in that super intense experience, I was not that experience. I was watching it because the knowledge that I had gave me space enough to know what was happening and not become it, right? That's part of the beauty.
Very cool.
Yeah,
Very cool. Well, thanks for answering my questions.
absolutely. Thanks for asking them.